uh, turn it over to my colleague Donna from Niagara. Donna, go ahead.
Okay, I would like to thank our two presenters today, Andrea Margaro and Julia Milski, right? Okay. You are doing a presentation on the rapid transition to remote learning in the face of COVID-19, faculty and staff-led wellness check incentive. So go ahead and take it from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to get my screen set up here. I will give a heads up as well. I'm in a room on our campus where the lights will turn off if there's no motion detected. So if you see me shifting in my seat, I'm just trying to keep the lights on above my head. So as I'm getting this set here, let's see. And a quick confirmation that you can't see my crazy speaker notes and the slides should just pop up. All right. Cool. Thank you, Andrea. Wonderful. So we'll do some introductions and then do a couple housekeeping things and then dive into the content. So I am Julia Mileski. I am the Assistant Director for Student Transition and Success at Binghamton University. I'm also a success coach here on campus. And today I'm presenting with my colleague, Andrea. I'll let you introduce yourself, Andrea.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea MacArgle. I'm the Director of Instructional Design Services in the Center for Learning and Teaching at Binghamton University. And I do want to mention, and Julia will mention this further, is that Julia works for the Student Affairs Division of the university, and I work for Academic Affairs for the university. And so we traditionally don't very much work together. And she'll elaborate on why I'm stating that and why that's important.
Yes. Thank you for that. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. If anyone has questions throughout the presentation, we do encourage you to pop them in the chat. When either one of us is presenting, the other presenter will be checking the chat box, responding to questions as they come in. And then if there's questions that we need each other's expertise on, we'll just wait and address those at the end of the presentation as well. So we encourage you to put your questions in the chat box there. All right, so just a brief overview of the objectives for today's session. So we are going to be talking about our wellness check initiative that we completed in the spring term in response to COVID-19. And so we're hoping that at the end of this session, you'll be able to take away, what are the steps necessary to plan and deploy a wellness check initiative to keep your university students engaged. And then, some methods of collaborating cross-divisionally to support the same mission of student success. Okay, so we'll dive into some of the details here. So the working group behind this initiative was brought together by top-tier leadership at our institution, really just a couple days after we announced our, transition to remote learning. So this happened about mid-March. And they identified a need for us to, share a message of care with our university students, but also to keep the lines of communication open to make sure that our students were going to be persisting through the term, completing their coursework, and, trying to just really provide that level of support during the time of crisis. So as a group, we identified 3 goals for our initiative, and you'll see those goals on the screen there. And so we really wanted to focus on, as I mentioned previously, keeping our students engaged, being a direct referral source to our students. So as we all know, in whichever positions we have at our institutions, there are so many minute details of academic policy, access to technology, general student support that we all work with, and making sure that our students were connected with the correct support that they needed, or the correct, resources that they needed to persist. And then the last thing was just providing accurate and fact-driven information based on the resources provided. Because of this response, this response was so quick. It was a rapid transition, as our title states. We wanted to make sure that we had the most up-to-date information for our students and also for our colleagues available when we were making these phone calls. So as you can see with the timeline there, we pulled our efforts together in about 2 weeks. So mid-March, this working group met multiple times within a 2-week period, pulled together the training, which I'll dive a lot more into in the future slides here, pulled together our training resources, and then made calls from really, well, it was the month of April that our volunteers were making their calls. At the end of April and early May, we started to transition the content of our calls from wellness check to registration reminders. We were starting to feel that crunch of the end of the semester and our fall 2020 course registration window closing. So we ended up pivoting to focus a little bit more on those registration reminders, which we'll cover more in depth later in the presentation as well. Okay, so how we identified our students. So with the help of our Center for Learning and Teaching and student records, we really were able to identify the population based on a few factors. Which students signed in with their Binghamton credentials, their Binghamton University credentials on Blackboard and on Zoom. So presumably those who were, who didn't sign in, they were disengaged with their coursework, maybe having a harder time with the transition, or maybe they just checked out entirely from their coursework due to this rapid transition. So we used that as one of the base identifying factors of which students we would be making these phone calls to. We also used data from our Starfish progress survey that was sent out to our instructors. So the instructors were encouraged to, flag any students who were deemed as missing or, no longer showing up to class, if you will, no longer engaged with their course content. So those two factors, identified right around 1,300 students for us. And that was our, first cohort of students that we worked with to make these wellness check calls. So once we had those students identified, we then turned our attention to, okay, with 1,300 students, we need volunteers. So our two pillars of recruitment were really based on collaboration and targeted messaging. As Andrea mentioned, I work in student affairs, and we were really looking for our entire university to be engaged in this effort. So we collaborated with our Professional Staff Senate, the chair of our Professional Staff Senate, who is part of our Division of Research. And we really worked together to get some targeted messaging out through Professional Staff Senate, also through our digest email. So we get a daily email called Dateline on our campus, and we sent out some targeted information with the help of University Communications and Marketing. They were integral in helping us pull together some of that verbiage to call for volunteers. We also had, the buy-in from our top tier leadership. So our vice presidents of the divisions, our vice provost and provost, were all on board for sending out targeted messages to their divisions to, recruit these volunteers, explain what those three goals were from our efforts, and then, see who is available during this time to help out with our wellness check initiative. So a snapshot of our volunteers. As we mentioned, it was a cross-divisional effort, really university-wide. So we had representation from all divisions on campus, which was really cool. I do have to say, just candidly, a really nice, picture of during times of need, everyone kind of just pulling together and getting the job done that needs to get done. So we did have, again, all divisions. We had a mixture of staff, faculty, and even some students as well. The students who were engaged were those who were employed by the university. So, peer advisors, peer assistants, some teaching assistants. So they were student leaders that we had already identified and specifically targeted as well. We had 40 volunteers total and 14 staff members who were in advising or student support roles. So we did loop in some of our colleagues who were already in that student facing, making outreach or doing outreach to students to make sure that they were staying on track. So in total, we had, around a little bit over 50 volunteers helping us with this effort. So this was kind of my expertise area. So the training and development, or the training development part, there was a subgroup of us who coordinated the training. And so it was myself, Andrea, and our Professional Staff Senate chair. And we met a few times to identify which skill sets would be needed to be consistently, understood across the board. So we're working again with faculty, staff, and students. So the skill sets that our volunteers had were really, across the entire spectrum of, understanding student development and student needs to, understanding what resources were available on campus. So we wanted to make sure that we developed a training that would meet all of those needs. So we met, identified those skills, and then figured out what resources do we already have in existence. You know, it was a tough time for, I think, everybody during the transition. So we thought, what already exists? How can we package this in a way that will best, you know, support our volunteers? So each volunteer received access to the training content, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but it did consist of a Google Slides presentation and then some information we sent out to them through email as well. As far as the coordination goes for the volunteers, so I was a manager of the volunteers there. So when they would, you know, raise their hand and say, yes, I'm available, that was done through a Google form that was sent out through email. And then I would correspond with them through email and say, all right, thank you for volunteering. And here are, you know, the next steps. Here's the training. Here's what we, you know, are asking you to do. So some of the training content that we covered, as I mentioned, we did a Google Slides presentation. So we did do an overview of our remote phone access. So that was a concern of a lot of our volunteers were, you know, do I need to use my own phone? If the volunteers had a university issued computer or a university issued technology at home with them, they could use their university issued telephone number. And that was through MyTel or soft phone that we use on our campus. So they were able to access and, you know, make calls from their university number, which helped out as well when a university number is calling a student as opposed to, you know, just a random number coming through. We did have basic attending skills listed. Again, just trying to cover all of our bases and, you know, the level of knowledge that our volunteers had and the varying level that our volunteers had as well. We provided a list of updated information. So again, this was based on the rapid transition across our campus. Some offices were open and, you know, all of their services made virtual. Some offices were still in that in between. Others, they didn't have the support staff to, you know, transition to virtual. So we did provide a list of all updated operations for our, you know, our resources that students might need referrals to. And then we also provided quick reference guides. And so that had a sample script in it, you know, a script for if the student did pick up the phone, maybe a parent or a family member picked up the phone, depending on if it was a cell phone or a home phone number we were calling. And then also, you know, what to say in a voicemail message. So we really wanted to cover all the basis for this training content to make sure that our volunteers felt comfortable. The biggest thing with this and the biggest recommendation I would make is if you're planning to do a response similar to this, is making sure that the volunteers know that they aren't intending to fix any problems. They're really there to be a messenger so that, you know, the volunteer will reach out, identify what the issues are, and then refer to the appropriate resources. Andrea will talk a little bit more about, you know, how we captured that information and how we can, you know, go back and assess that information of what our students' needs were. But that was an important part of the piece to make sure that we were having, you know, some of those challenges that our students were facing communicated up to our administration to make sure we could change policy or provide support where there were gaps were existing. All right, wonderful. So I am going to pass it off to Andrea now, and she's going to continue telling you more about our efforts.
So thank you, Julia. So as Julia mentioned earlier, we used Starfish to do a progress survey. And so we had thought, okay, how are we going to capture the results of all of this outreach? And we decided to just use Starfish because it was successful with our progress surveys in the past. Initially, they were thinking that, okay, we'll just send everybody Excel spreadsheets and people will make notes on Excel spreadsheets and then we'll collect the spreadsheets. And that obviously, with all of the volunteers and the changing nature of it, we thought, okay, let's abandon that. That's gonna be a nightmare. We also thought about having a shared Google sheet where it was like everybody's name is on there and who they're matched with and the results. Would be an option, but then we didn't want to share data we wanted the data to be gate kept so that the volunteers only had the information for their students and only the information that we wanted to use. So we decided to use Starfish. Starfish is it's not like a survey software like Qualtrics. Starfish is a student success platform that's used for early alerts and for appointment making. It's used at about, I think, 32 of the SUNY campuses, and it's pretty popular software. And we've been using Starfish that was actually our first semester. Spring 2019 was or 2020 was the first semester we used it for early alerts, though we had been using it for scheduling before that. So what we did in Starfish, if you guys are familiar with Starfish at all, we created, Starfish is based on roles and permissions. So for each role, you have a permission set associated with that role. And so we created a role that was just for these people that had very little permissions, so that they didn't have access to data that they weren't going to have. And what Starfish allowed us to do is to, again, match the volunteers to the students. And so the volunteers only saw their students and had a list of their students that could be changed. So if, for example, as Julia had mentioned, they weren't on Blackboard and now they're engaged, we can remove them as they're not missing anymore, so they don't need to be called. And we could do that on a daily basis. So the changing nature of who needs to be called can be changed daily. It provided the volunteers their information, so their phone number, both their home phone and their cell phone. I'll talk more about that later. What it most provided for all of us is a centralized area to record the notes. So Starfish allows for you to take notes on your interactions with the students, and then you can report on that note. So I could run reports, or other people could run reports to see the results of the calls. And that was the key, as Julie had mentioned, because we wanted to take action based off of the results of the calls. So next slide, Julia. So from April 3rd to May 8th, we made the volunteers made 1,165 calls. So thought that was pretty successful. Obviously, we did not get to all the students. There were to 972 students, but that doesn't mean that we didn't reach everybody that we needed, because again, I said that some students that were initially identified were removed after they weren't missing anymore. So of the calls, about 60% were for wellness checked, and the other percent was for registration reminders. And out of the results, and this was consistent since the first week, is that about 33% of them actually had a conversation with the student. So as you can see from the chart, or from the pie chart, a majority were, is the word majority? Yeah, I guess I'd say majority, were left a message on their voicemail, and sharing, as Julie had mentioned, a script of what they would say. Here are the resources, here's who you can call, et cetera, et cetera. But about 33% spoke to the student, and then some spoke to family members. We did have issues, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, with unable to leave message. Either they had problems with their voicemail, or we had the wrong number. Okay, next slide. So out of the calls that were that somebody actually spoke to a student, there were 380 calls that actually spoke to a student. And those calls, the comments on the calls were left by the volunteer as a note on the call in the Starfish system. And then we grouped those calls in those notes we coded them and grouped those codes into these 5 categories. And do know that, you could be both positive and have a question. So it's not like it could be one, you're not all in one category. So the positives, as you can see, out of 380 calls, 282 resulted in a positive interaction. So to me, that's great. That means that our students were not terribly, struggling terribly, as we had, worried about. Although we did have, 210 challenges that somebody spoke to them. So it wasn't all, sunshine and roses, but for the most part, the students were, doing fine. Next slide. So these were the top comments. So out of the 380 calls that we had, 243 were doing fine, okay, well, everything's going fine. So you can see that a vast majority of the top comment was everything's going all right. The next highest one that people mentioned was that the students were having problems with focus, mindset, stress, or motivation, which could be expected. Coursework challenges was close to that. The next comment again was a revising referral, so they had questions for advising, and then the next one was difficult start and transition. So a lot of them, because I did most of the coding, you'll see that they had a difficult start and transition, but then now they're doing fine. So the top comments were, I would say that we were satisfied with, how our students were doing based off of these comments. Next slide. So as I said, these were very typical comments where the students said that, like, right when they started, they were feeling a bit stressed, but overall they're doing well. They did feel a bit lack of motivation and a bit of isolation, not being involved. And then, as Julia said, we shared some resources for them. And then a lot of the times, we had the volunteer would refer them to their faculty member, and that was mentioned often in the notes. Next slide. I did want to include some of the bottom comments because these were things that we were really worried about in the first time. We were really worried initially that they wouldn't have technology, that they would be upset with the faculty member, that there's something the faculty member were doing wrong. Even though we have great faculty, we were really concerned that the faculty were very overwhelmed too, and it would trickle down to the students, or that they were having issues with, the internet or Zoom or Panopto, which is our streaming media server. And really, this was not the case in the calls that we made. Now, obviously, these could still be problems with the people that we didn't speak to. But out of the students that we spoke to, only 5 of them said that they had a problem with their, needing a computer. And so that, to me and to us, was a good sign in that they had access to that, or our communications on how to get access to that, because our campus did provide loaner computers to students, that those communications were being successful because clearly these were not problems. So we were satisfied, things that we were really worried about actually didn't materialize as being problems that we had. Next slide. Now, this wasn't without challenges. That we did have some challenges just throughout the whole initiative, and I did want to share those with you all today. So one of the challenges we had was really identifying students that were missing. As Julia had mentioned, we used data that was from the university Zoom accounts and Blackboard. So if a faculty member was not using Blackboard for a course, then we wouldn't have data on the students logging into Blackboard. If the students were using Zoom accounts that weren't their Binghamton credentialed Zoom accounts, then we wouldn't have data on that. So there was just an issue with missing data because the students were not accessing the university accounts like we had. One of the other issues was recruiting, training, and retaining volunteers. Julia and Kevin from Professional Staff Senate did a great job with recruiting and training, but we did have initially 83 people volunteered, and then, as Julia had said, only 40 people ended up making calls. So we ended up losing a lot of folks who initially volunteered and then realized, like, oh, I had great intentions, but I'm also extremely overwhelmed and can't be making these calls, which we understand, completely understandable. But that did pose some problems when we were matching the students to the volunteer, because we would match 20 students to the volunteer, and then 3 days later, the volunteer would say, oh, I can't do this anymore. And then we'd have to rematch those 20 students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, keep repeating. So it was a daily process that things were changing of all the time. And because of how we have our Starfish system set up, everything pushes overnight. So we couldn't do things we couldn't change things and then they would be reflected in a couple minutes. Everything is an overnight push. One of the biggest challenges we had also was having the correct phone numbers for students. Before we even did this, before the Wellness Check Initiative, we didn't even have phone numbers in Starfish. That was not data that was pushed into Starfish because advisors could access that information through our banner system. They wouldn't need it through Starfish, but because all these volunteers were not in the banner system in that role, we had to push this information in, and the data was not complete because we had students that just didn't provide their cell phone number, and then their home phone number maybe had changed or was their parents, etc. So we had issues with that. And then finally, one of the challenges was consistent note keeping by volunteers. Even though we did provide pretty, what I would say, comprehensive training and clear directions, the notes were not as, I would say, consistent exactly as we would have liked. And because of this, any of you that ever, do coding on qualitative data, you know that like when the data is not consistent, it takes a lot more time. And because I was the only one doing the manual coding of it, it took a while because they wouldn't like label the subject correctly. And so I'd have to read all the things instead of just simply reading the correct subject. So that was difficult, but not overcomable. It just, took a lot more time than I would have liked to code the notes to be able to provide actionable items to the university. Yeah, that's it. All right. Next slide. I think I'm turning it back to you, Julia. So.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. So we did want to mention as well, I mentioned briefly at the beginning that we did end up pivoting our efforts from the Wellness Check initiative to a registration reminder. And so we reached out to those students, identified a separate cohort of students, and these were those students who had not yet registered for fall 2020 courses. So on April 30th, they switched over from April 30th to May, right around May 5th. Some phone calls were made a little bit after the fact to May 8th. And we were reaching out to those students to say, are you intending on enrolling in courses? Do you need assistance with enrolling in courses? Kind of what's going on here. So we did work closely with our academic advising offices to make sure, if students were referred to us, if we reached out and they said, I just need to connect with an advisor, that there were advising, appointments available as well. And so this was really a couple different goals from this pivot, was to, again, get a sense of, your students just not planning to return right now and for retention, but then also, why is there such a big gap of what we normally see our students pre-register for fall, and kind of some explanation behind the numbers that were being reported. So with that, again, Andrea had mentioned one of our challenges was the retainment of volunteers. And you could imagine the last 2 weeks of a very, uncommon semester, quite a few volunteers ended up needing to step back because of their normal end of semester duties. So a lot of our faculty who were volunteering, quite a few of our support staff who were volunteering did have to step back from their position as a volunteer during this time. So we ended up working with a much smaller group of volunteers for the registration reminders, but we were still able to contact, a small group of students to see, why they hadn't registered yet, or if we could support them in that registration process as well. So it was important to include this, I think, because right in our first effort, we took the model that we employed with our wellness check and we tried to apply it again, just for a different mission. And, if we had the same buy-in from our volunteers, I think the registration reminders would have, again, been successful, the same success that we had seen with the wellness check initiative. So just a little bit of that, immediate application of the model that we had built as well. All right, so at this time, we will, open up the floor for any questions. We do ask that you pop them in the chat box, and, we'll start to go through. Andrea and I will also share our emails in the chat box. So if you have additional questions on any of the content that we shared, we welcome you to reach out to us.
Right, so Julia, John asked what % of the missing students started to attend their courses? We don't have access to that data. That's a great question. I don't believe that we had any, I would say, different retention from spring to fall of our first year students or other students, our retention numbers did not look markedly different this academic year as they have in the past. One of the challenges with the data was that normally there's a withdrawal deadline that the students can have, that like all of us have a withdrawal deadline, but in the spring, the withdrawal deadline was after the courses were over. So a lot of students, maybe they didn't attend, but then they withdrew from the class after the class was over. So it's was difficult. One of the challenges that we also face is that neither Julia or I have ready access to a lot of data because of our roles. It's not we're not in admissions or things like that. So that was a challenge, and that if we were to do this again, which I hope we don't ever have to do this again, that at least for this purpose, that we would hopefully be able to work more closely with the folks that have access to that data.
To address the question, so if we carried this into the fall, so we did not carry the wellness check initiative into the fall right now, and I'll also let Andrea speak a little bit more to this, but we do have a pretty comprehensive group that works with our early alert system and have been pushing it out to our campus and our instructors to identify any students who they might have concerns with. And then, different support services will reach out based on the early alert that is raised on that student. But as far as this specific effort, we didn't continue it into the fall.
I would say that I think that previously with early alerts, and I can't speak to all the advising offices, but I do feel like now they are making more phone calls than previously. Like previously with early alerts that were raised, there would be a lot of email communication and some phone calls, but I think that now it seems to be, at least from what I have noticed, is that there is an increase in phone calls. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability within Starfish to do text messaging, although that would be extremely helpful. Okay,
Wonderful.
Yes, dealing with ghosting your courses right now. Okay, we're doing our midterm evaluations, our midterm progress survey right now, and that's happening to our faculty as well, Jason. So you're not alone. Starfish is amazing. We have really enjoyed it. It's very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, we did. I know Andrea shared the data on how many students did actually pick up the phone. We did have some students who called back. Now we didn't have the data on that, but I did speak with some volunteers who just candidly, and they shared, that they left a message for a student and they did receive a return phone call. So I'm hopeful that even, if they checked their voicemail, that even if they didn't return the phone call, just hearing a message from the university communicating that, message of care made a difference as well.
And they mentioned that too.
Yes.
And when this volunteer spoke with the students, they're like, oh, somebody's calling me. This is so nice. That that one of the goals of like, we care about you was like being heard. I think that's all our time, but as Julia said, I'm going to put my email in the chat if you all want to talk about this work or anything related to it. Feel free to shoot me an email, and I speak for Julia, where I'm sure she feels the same way.
Thank you very much to both of you. It sounds like you had a very fun end of spring semester like the rest of us, but it looks like you really work things together, and thanks for the presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.